So if we ask the question, does this mean that the environment has no influence on bee behavior transition? Is it all about genes because all of these genes are involved? And of course, whenever I ask that question, does this mean it's only the environment? The answer is going to be no. If I ask the question, does this mean it's only due to genes? The question's going to be no. One of your quiz questions was that. Okay, so of course the environment is going to influence what's going on. And what I've written here is that it's environmental factors that are critical for every element of gene expression within organisms. For every element of gene expression. Okay? So remember that, what is gene expression? Gene expression, or genes being turned on, same thing, is the DNA that's transcribed into RNA. Remember transcription? That gene's expressed as soon as it's transcribed into RNA. And as we know, that RNA leaves the nucleus into the cytoplasm where it's translated into protein. Okay. But it's the environment that supplies these building blocks that it needs to be able to do this. Okay, you can't express a gene and turn it into RNA unless you have those subunits, those building blocks like beads on a string for messenger RNA. And those building blocks are bases like adenine, and instead of thymine in RNA, we have a base called uracil. We have cytosine, we have guanine. So if you can imagine all these molecules out here, all these cytosines, all these guanines, uracils, okay, they're in the environment, they come into the cell, and then they can make their way into the nucleus. And again, it's really complicated as to how all that happens in order for transcription into RNA to occur. Those environmental components have to be there. Okay. By the same token, the proteins are only going to be translated, right? We're only going to be able to make protein if we have their building blocks. And the building blocks of proteins, as you might recall, are these amino acids, right? I'm just using AA to abbreviate amino acid. So those are out in the environment, right? Where do they come from? They come from food. They come from your diet, right? Where are you getting this stuff? The bees are getting it from the pollen and from the nectar and from resources within the environment. And those resources can vary. Okay, so the amino acids that are brought in, the bases that are brought in, can even help at the most basic level determine whether or not the genes are going to be expressed. Okay, so amino acids and bases for RNA are not the only kinds of things that are in the environment. Those are just kind of the start. There are many other things that are out there that affect the cellular chemical environment to start with, and then we'll talk more about the other aspects of the environment. But consider, for example, that there are compounds like pheromones, which you may or may not have heard of. Pheromones are similar to hormones. They're chemicals that are produced by animals that are often released into the air, okay, as opposed to a hormone that's secreted inside of a body and from cell to cell. Okay, so pheromones are released and they can go to another organism and influence it. And in particular, there are some pheromones that actually can affect gene expression in the brains of these worker bees. Okay, and so these kinds of chemicals can cause one gene to be expressed, and then that may cause a certain protein to be produced, like another pheromone or a hormone, okay, and then that's going to affect the expression of another gene, okay. That environmental factor may, in fact, go back and affect the expression of the first gene, okay. That expression of that gene actually is the environmental factor that causes gene expression in the first gene, and so on. So genes affect environmental factors, which affect other genes, which produce other environmental factors. All of those environmental factors can go back and influence the gene expression. Okay, so basically what I want you to understand, this idea of a cascade, right? People think of cascade as of a waterfall, right? A cascading series of gene-environment interactions that occurs throughout the development of the organism, through the development of the brain, and thus the behavior of the bee. Let's look at a specific example. Okay, so one important compound for the nurse bee forager transition is this stuff called juvenile hormone. Again, we know hormones are proteins, right? So the gene that codes for juvenile hormone boosts its output at about 3 weeks. Remember that graph? It took like 21, 25 days by the time they were transitioning from nurse bee to forager. And so the presence of juvenile hormone seems to have something to do with the transition to forager. But why is the gene boosting its output after 3 weeks? Why doesn't it do it sooner? Why now? Why is that gene expressed then as opposed to earlier? Okay, and the answer seems to be that it has to do with the social environment. Okay, and you can do these experiments because if you have hives that are younger or older, you'll see that when there's an absence of older foragers around, the juvenile hormone outputs are going to be pretty high. And when there's many older foragers around, the juvenile hormone output is low. Okay, so why is that? Okay, and that has to do with another compound, and I'm trying to not get too complicated here, but foragers produce a chemical that can inhibit juvenile hormone production. Okay, so if the foragers around, they inhibit nurse bees into becoming more foragers. All right, so if you've got plenty of foragers around, you don't need any more. All right, if you do something where you remove all the foragers from the colony and now they're absent, juvenile hormone production goes up and the nurse bees suddenly start making their transition. And this is how bee colonies keep a good balance of how many nurse bees around, how many forager bees do we need around. It's controlled by these chemical compounds. And these compounds work by turning the gene for juvenile hormone on when it needs to be turned on and turning it off when it needs to be turned off. I love this quote by Gene Robinson, who said that DNA is both inherited and environmentally responsive. So when we don't want to think about DNA as just nature, okay? DNA is both inherited and it responds to the environment. Okay, so moving on to thinking a little bit more about environmental influences, people often think of learning as something that comes from the environment. Is it a genetic instinct? Were you just born with it? Is it in your genes? Or did you have to learn it somehow? And again, this is just a flawed question, okay? Because learning involves genes, okay? People often talk about them. Even today, you can pick up a newspaper article today and it will talk about how there's a difference between whether or not a particular behavior has been learned or whether it's in the genes, okay? And again, this is just a problematic way of looking at things, okay? So learned behaviors are not just environmentally determined. And let's talk a little bit more about an example of learning. One example is song learning in birds. And in fact, most bird species don't learn how to sing. Most bird species, when a baby is born, you can take that bird and put it in isolation and it'll still sing its species song perfectly. But some birds, like white-crowned sparrows, males in particular, learn how to sing their song by listening to others sing. And there are other birds that do this as well, such as zebra finches. And so what's interesting about these birds, if you take a baby bird and put it in complete isolation so that it never gets to hear anything throughout its developmental stage, it will never sing. It'll just make a sort of sad little twittering sound. So it has to be able to learn. Does this mean that genes have nothing to do with how white-crowned sparrows learn how to sing? And of course, you know the answer to that question is no. Okay, of course genes are going to be involved as well. This slide shows in the zebra finch how hearing for males, for young boy zebra finch birds and for other birds, how important it is to hear the father sing. Okay, so we have the father here, and these graphs are what we call sonograms, and you don't have to know that much about what they are, but they're a visual representation of what the song would sound like da 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 da. And an intact son, as you can see, has the same song as the father because he grew up listening to his father sing. It's not exactly the same, and that's another point that we'll raise. But if you take a bird and you deafen it, what will happen is it will not be able to sing a proper song. It sings something, but it doesn't sing a proper song. Can it not sing at all? No, it can sing, but it doesn't sing the song of the Father.